you wanted a deep dive into the Exorcist franchise. Buckle up. We're about to explore why this series, which kicked off way back in 1973, still has such a grip on us. We're
Hmm.
talking novels, films spanning decades, prequels, sequels, a whole legacy that just won't quit.
What's fascinating is how The Exorcist taps into those primal fears.
Okay.
The unknown, the darkness within, the potential for innocence to be corrupted. But it goes beyond typical horror tropes.
Okay, so corrupted innocence, demonic possession. We're not dealing with Freddy Krueger here. But what else is going on? Why does this story resonate so deeply, even decades later?
Part of it is the blend of reality and fiction. William Peter Blatty, the author, was deeply inspired by a 1949 exorcism case of a young boy in Maryland. He used newspaper clippings and even spoke with priests involved in the case.
So he wasn't just pulling this out of thin air. That's a whole other level of creepy. Did any specific details from that case make it into the book or film?
Absolutely. For example, reports of the boy's bed shaking violently and objects moving inexplicably in the room found their way into Regan's experiences. Blatty took these real-world elements and amplified them, creating a chilling narrative that blurred the lines between fact and fiction.
That based on a true story element definitely adds to the scare factor. And then that story became this groundbreaking film. Wasn't The Exorcist, the 1973 version, a total game changer for horror?
It absolutely was. We're talking about the first horror film ever nominated for a Best Picture Oscar. Director William Friedkin used a combination of innovative special effects and psychological realism to create a truly visceral experience.
But horror doesn't usually get that kind of recognition from the Academy. What made this different? Was it just the special effects?
The effects were groundbreaking, yes. Think about that head-spinning scene. Even today, it's unsettling. But The Exorcist went beyond shock value. Friedkin focused on the characters' emotional journeys, their struggles with faith and doubt, and the agonizing powerlessness they felt in the face of evil. It was this depth, this exploration of the human condition amidst the horror that resonated with audiences and critics alike.
Okay, so we have groundbreaking special effects, compelling characters, but we're also dealing with demonic possession here. That's pretty heavy subject matter, even for horror. How did audiences react back then? Weren't some people totally freaked out?
Oh, there are legendary stories of people fainting in theaters, walking out, even experiencing psychological distress after watching the film. It pushed boundaries and confronted viewers with the darkest aspects of faith and belief.
That's pretty intense. So the first film set a high bar, but the franchise didn't exactly have a smooth ride after that, did it?
You're thinking of Exorcist II, the
Oh,
heretic, right? The 1977 sequel that went in a very different direction.
the one that's considered, well, a bit of a cinematic disaster, right? But you mentioned earlier that it had a cult following. How is that even possible?
Exorcist II is fascinating because while it was panned by critics for its surreal, almost psychedelic approach, that very quality is what attracts its devoted fans.
So it's more about the visuals and the overall weirdness than the story itself.
Exactly. Director John Borman focused on exploring Regan's trauma and recovery after the possession, employing dreamlike sequences and symbolic imagery. It wasn't what audiences expecting a straightforward horror sequel, but for some, that unconventionality is what makes it intriguing.
Okay, so one groundbreaking film, one divisive sequel. Where did the franchise go from there?
Interestingly, William Peter Blatty, the author of the original novel, stepped back into the director's chair for The Exorcist III in 1990. This time, he adapted his own novel, Legion, which had a very different feel from The Exorcist.
So less demonic possession, more psychological thriller. Did this one bring the franchise back to its roots?
In a way, yes. Blatty shifted the focus to a series of gruesome murders investigated by a detective who was a friend of Father Dyer from the original film. The demonic element is still there, but it's more subtle, woven into a suspenseful narrative about identity, guilt, and the lingering effects of trauma.
And this one actually got good reviews, right? Critics responded well to the psychological depth.
They did. Many critics praised The Exorcist III for its suspense, its atmospheric dread, and its philosophical exploration of good and evil. There's even one scene, a now iconic jump scare in a hospital hallway, that became legendary for its effectiveness.
Ah, yes, the infamous hallway jump scare. I've heard about that one. So it seems like the third film managed to find a balance between the intensity of the original and the exploration of deeper themes. But then we get to the prequels and things get a little complicated.
Ah, yes, the prequels. A bit of a stumble, you could say. Two films, two different attempts to tell the story of Father Merrin's first encounter with evil.
Wait, two different films covering the same story? That's unusual. Tell me more about that. What happened?
Well, Exorcist, The Beginning, directed by Rennie Harlan, was released in 2004. It took a more action-oriented approach, focusing on Father Merrin's experiences in World War II and his first encounter with the demon Pazuzu in Africa.
And it didn't go over so well. What was the issue?
Critics felt it relied too heavily on CGI and lacked the psychological depth of the original films. The studio, sensing a missed opportunity, decided to go back and make another prequel.
And that's how we got Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist in 2005, directed by Paul Schrader, right? But wasn't that basically the same story?
It was, but with a completely different tone and approach. Schrader's version is a much quieter, more introspective film. It delves into Father Merrin's internal struggles with faith and doubt, exploring the psychological toll of confronting such profound evil.
So, two prequels, two contrasting styles. It's interesting to see how the franchise was trying to find new ways to approach the same material. But then we jump forward to 2023.
And we arrive at The Exorcist, Believer, the latest installment directed by David Gordon Green. This one takes a bold step. It's a direct sequel to the 1973 original, ignoring all the other films that came in between.
So, are we back to Reagan's story? Is this a continuation of her journey?
Not quite. It picks up decades later and focuses on the possession of two young girls, their fates intertwined in a way that echoes Reagan's experience. Chris McNeil, Reagan's mother from the first film, returns to help these girls and confront the demonic forces once again.
I've heard this one got mixed reviews. What's the general consensus? Did it manage to capture the essence of the original?
It's a bit divisive. Some critics felt it was too derivative, relying on familiar tropes and jump scares. But others appreciated the attempt to recapture the atmosphere and dread of the 1973 classic, while also introducing new elements to the mythology.
And this is just the beginning of a whole new trilogy, right? What can we expect from the upcoming sequels?
The Exorcist, Deceiver, is scheduled for 2025, and another sequel is planned after that. The filmmakers have been tight-lipped about the plot details, but they've hinted that we'll delve deeper into the themes of faith, doubt, and the consequences of confronting evil.
Okay, so the franchise is still going strong, still finding new ways to terrify and intrigue us. But beyond all the special effects and jump scares, I think what's really fascinating is how The Exorcist tackles these big, profound themes.
You're absolutely right. It's not just about demonic possession. It's about our deepest fears, our beliefs, and the very nature of good and evil.
It's almost like the franchise is holding up a mirror to our anxieties, forcing us to confront the darkness that we might prefer to ignore. But it also explores the potential for hope, for resilience in the face of that darkness.
Exactly, and that's what makes it so compelling. It's not just a horror franchise. It's a reflection of the human condition, our struggles, our beliefs, and our enduring search for meaning in a world where evil can sometimes feel very real.
Well said. So we've covered a lot of ground here. The origins of the franchise, the evolution of the films, the key players, and those big, thought-provoking themes. But I think there's even more to uncover, especially when it comes to the cultural impact and the legacy of The Exorcist.
Absolutely, because this franchise didn't just entertain, it sparked debates, influenced filmmakers, and left an indelible mark on our collective consciousness.
Okay, then let's keep digging. What exactly did The Exorcist do to revolutionize the horror genre? It wasn't the first horror film, so what set it apart?
The Exorcist didn't just join the horror genre.
Yeah.
It reshaped the landscape.
Yeah.
Think about what was popular before. Monster movies, slashers, psychological thrillers.
Okay.
The Exorcist brought a whole new level of intensity, this focus on demonic possession as a source of terror. It really upped the ante.
And it wasn't just about cheap scares, right? It brought in those deeper themes we talked about, faith, doubt, good versus evil.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It showed that horror could be more than just entertainment. It could be thought-provoking, even philosophical.
Right.
Suddenly there was this wave of possession-based horror films exploring similar themes.
Can you give me some examples of films that followed in The Exorcist's footsteps?
The Omen, which came out in 1976, is a great example.
Okay.
It's about a young boy who might be the Antichrist.
Wow.
Similar themes of demonic influence, the battle between good and evil,
Okay.
but a totally different context,
Right.
a different kind of horror.
So The Omen sort of picked up the torch.
Yeah.
But can we still see The Exorcist fingerprints on more modern horror films?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A film like Hereditary from 2018
Okay.
takes the concept of demonic inheritance and family curses to a whole new level of psychological horror.
Wow.
It's a slow burn.
Yeah.
A family drama that unravels into this terrifying nightmare.
Right.
But those themes of inherited evil,
Uh-huh.
of innocence corrupted,
Yeah.
They're straight from The Exorcist.
Wow, it's amazing how a film from 1973 can still resonate with audiences and inspire filmmakers decades later.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what it is about this franchise that continues to fascinate and even terrify audiences after all these years.
I think it goes back to those primal fears we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of being possessed,
Right.
of losing control of your own body and mind to an outside force.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Especially when you add in the religious element,
Right.
the idea of demonic forces at work. It's
Yeah.
like tapping into our deepest fears about the unknown.
Exactly.
Right.
It makes us question the nature of good and evil
Uh-huh.
and the fragility of our own humanity.
And no matter how advanced our world becomes,
Yeah.
those fundamental anxieties about what it means to be human,
Right.
about the darkness that might exist within us or around us,
Yeah.
those are timeless.
And The Exorcist doesn't shy away from those anxieties.
Right.
It makes you confront them head on.
What's interesting, though, is that even though the films are terrifying, even though they deal with these really dark, disturbing themes,
Right.
there's also this glimmer of hope, right? This idea that maybe, just maybe, evil can be overcome.
I think you're spot on.
Yeah.
It's not a hopeless franchise.
Right.
Yes, there's darkness, suffering,
Uh-huh.
but there's also this idea that faith, courage, and love
Yeah.
can ultimately triumph.
So it's not just about giving us nightmares.
Right.
It's about making us think, making us feel, making us question.
Yeah.
It's about exploring the full spectrum of human experience, even the darkest part.
And I think that's why The Exorcist continues to resonate with audiences.
Okay.
It's not just a horror franchise. It's a cultural touchstone that reflects our deepest fears and anxieties,
Oh.
but also our capacity for hope and resilience.
Okay.
It's a story about faith, family, and the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness.
We could talk for hours about the characters, the themes, the cultural impact.
Yeah.
But I think what's really amazing is that after all this time, after all these films, The Exorcist is still finding ways to surprise us.
Right.
I mean, how do you keep a franchise fresh and relevant for over 5 decades?
That's the mark of a truly enduring franchise, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about evolution, about taking risks,
Mm-hmm.
and about understanding what truly resonates with audiences.
Absolutely. So with that being said,
Yeah.
where do we go from here? What are those surprises? Those unexpected twists and turns that have kept The Exorcist relevant and terrifying for so long? All right, you mentioned surprises. What could The Exorcist possibly do at this point to really shock us?
Well, the fact that there are two competing versions of Father Merrin's backstory is pretty unusual in itself.
Right.
It shows a willingness to experiment, to try different approaches with the same material.
And we've seen that throughout the franchise, right?
Yeah.
From the surrealism of Exorcist 2 to the psychological thriller vibe of The Exorcist 3.
Right.
But what about more recent examples? How is The Exorcist Believer shaking things up?
Believer introduces the concept of multiple possessions. We're not just dealing with one girl like in the original, but two girls possessed simultaneously.
Right, and their fates are intertwined somehow. It adds a whole new layer of complexity, almost like the demonic forces are working together, spreading their influence.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just a rehash. They're finding new ways to explore possession. And the way they tie it back to the 1973 film is clever. Let's just say certain characters and events from the original come back to haunt the present.
Okay, that's definitely a surprise I didn't see coming. So it's building on the mythology, not just slapping a new coat of paint on the same old story.
Exactly. It's expanding the world of The Exorcist, adding new layers of meaning.
Which makes you wonder where they'll go with the next 2 films. What's the buzz around The Exorcist Deceiver?
It's coming out in 2025, and there are rumors that it will explore the consequences of confronting evil, the psychological and spiritual toll it takes on those involved.
So, digging deeper into the themes of faith and doubt, given what we know about the director's other work, do you think Deceiver will lean more into psychological horror, or will it go full-on supernatural?
That's a great question. David Gordon Green has shown he's comfortable with both. He directed the recent Halloween trilogy, which had a strong slasher element, but also explored the trauma and psychology of its characters.
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if Deceiver finds a way to blend those elements, giving us both visceral scares and thought-provoking themes.
Okay, you've got me hooked. Any other surprises we should be prepared for? I've heard whispers about bringing back characters from previous films.
There's definitely been talk of exploring Father Merrin's backstory even further. We know he had a profound encounter with evil early in his life, but there's still a lot we don't know. And yes, some fans are hoping for the return of Regan herself. Imagine Ellen Burstyn reprising her role after all these years.
That would be amazing. It would show just how enduring these characters are, how they've stayed with us all this time. So, what does this all mean? What's the takeaway from this deep dive into the Exorcist franchise?
The Exorcist is more than just a series of horror films.
Right.
It's a cultural phenomenon that reflects our deepest fears and anxieties, but also offers glimmers of hope and resilience. It keeps evolving, surprising us, and sparking conversation.
It's a franchise that's not afraid to take risks, to push boundaries, and explore the darkest corners of the human experience.
And that's why it continues to fascinate and terrify audiences. It taps into something primal, something universal that transcends time and trends.
Well said. So there you have it, folks, our deep dive into The Exorcist, a franchise that's still going strong after all these years. As you continue exploring these films, think about what resonates with you. What fears does it tap into? What questions does it raise? And most importantly, are you leaving the lights on tonight?